Take your crazy mother somewhere else. You're scaring my customers. The grocery store owner's voice cut through the cold Chicago morning like a blade. His face flushed red with rage as he pointed at two figures huddled on the sidewalk. Michael Chen, 47, owner of Chen's Market on Michigan Avenue for 20 years, pillar of the community, Chamber of Commerce member, untouchable. I don't care if you're hungry, I don't care if you're cold, get out of my sight. Evelyn Carter didn't say a word. She rose slowly from the frozen concrete, slipped the stale piece of bread she'd pulled from the dumpster behind the bakery into her jacket pocket, then gently helped her mother to her feet. Maggie was in the middle of a paranoid episode, jabbing a finger at the sky, screaming at pigeons that she insisted were government spies. Pedestrians hurried away. A few stopped to film on their phones, giggling. Eve was 27 years old, homeless, sleeping in a 1998 Honda Civic with a broken air conditioner. She'd once been a full scholarship student at Northwestern University, top of her class in mathematics. Now she worked whatever jobs would take her, washing dishes, clearing tables, handing out flyers. No boss kept her long because every few days she had to call out suddenly to care for her mother. No boss accepted that. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and the price of survival. Comment where you're listening from. Subscribe to channel. Let me tell you who Evelyn Carter really was before the world tried to erase her. Born Evelyn Hayes in 1997 to Richard and Margaret Hayes. Middle-class family. Father worked as an accountant. Mother was an elementary school teacher. They lived in a small house in Evanston. Not rich, but comfortable enough. Eve showed signs of genius early. By age 7, she was solving algebra problems that confused high school students. By 12, she'd won every math competition in the state. Her parents divorced when she was 14. Standard story. Dad got tired of the responsibility, but here's what nobody knew. Richard Hayes didn't just leave. He abandoned them completely. No child support, no alimony, no forwarding address, just a note on the kitchen table that said, "I can't do this anymore." Margaret Hayes, Eve's mother, had always been anxious. High-strung, people called it. The stress of single motherhood on a teacher's salary, combined with the betrayal and abandonment, shattered something fundamental in her mind. Within 6 months, she'd developed full schizophrenia, hallucinations, paranoid delusions, days where she didn't recognize her own daughter. Eve was 15 years old. She tried to keep going, tried to keep her mother stable while maintaining her grades. She got a full scholarship to Northwestern at 17, the youngest student in her cohort. Her professors called her a once-in-a-generation talent. She was going to change the field of applied mathematics. Everyone said so. But Margaret got worse. She'd wander into traffic, set fires in the apartment because she thought they were listening through the electrical outlets. Eve couldn't leave her alone. She couldn't afford the kind of psychiatric care her mother needed. Teacher's insurance didn't cover it. Medicaid had a 2-year waiting list. Eve dropped out of Northwestern halfway through her sophomore year. She told herself it was temporary, just until she got her mother stabilized, just until she figured things out. She never went back. The landlord evicted them 6 months later. Margaret's screaming disturbed the other tenants. Eve lost her job at the campus bookstore when she didn't return to school. They spent 1 month in a shelter, but Margaret's episodes terrified the other residents. The shelter asked them to leave for everyone's safety. They'd been living in that 1998 Honda Civic for 2 years. The car barely ran. The air conditioning had been broken since Eve bought it for $800 from a man at a gas station. She parked it in different places each night so the police wouldn't cite her for illegal camping. She worked every minimum wage job she could find. Most of her money went to food, and what medication she could afford for her mother from the community health clinic. Their meals were leftovers from restaurants, sometimes bread from dumpsters. Chicago winters were brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. Eve gave her mother the only blanket and curled up shivering through the long nights. There were times she thought she wouldn't make it to morning. But she always did, because her mother needed her. What Eve didn't know was that someone was watching her. Someone who would pull her into a world where leather and chrome meant more than blood, where loyalty was earned through steel and fire, and where the father who'd abandoned her had already set in motion a betrayal that would nearly destroy everything she'd fought to protect. It started 7 months before everything exploded. A small bakery called Helen's Bakery on the corner of State Street. Eve had been sitting outside the shop every morning for a week, waiting for them to open so she could ask for day-old pastries. Sometimes they gave them to her, sometimes they chased her away. This morning was different. An older woman stepped out at 6 a.m., gray hair twisted in a neat bun, kind eyes behind reading glasses. Helen Chen. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. Instead, she went back inside and returned with a hot cup of coffee and a freshly baked croissant, steam still rising. "You've been sitting here every morning for a week. I think it's time we properly met." Eve looked up, suspicious. Kindness always had a price. Helen sat down beside her on the cold step, not caring that her white apron would get dirty. "I'm Helen. And you?" "Evelyn. Eve." "So, Eve, tell me, why is a young girl like you sitting here every morning?" Eve meant to lie. She was used to lying. But when she looked into Helen's eyes and saw no judgment, no contempt, only genuine concern, she couldn't. The truth spilled out. About the father who'd left 12 years ago. About the mother whose mind had broken. About dropping out of Northwestern. About the car with the broken air conditioner. About the nights so cold she thought they'd die. Helen listened without interrupting. When Eve finished, Helen asked, "Can you wash dishes? Sweep floors? Carry trays?" Eve blinked. "I can do any job, ma'am." "Good. You start tomorrow. I pay by the day, and your mother can sit in the back room while you work. I've got a small sofa back there." Eve couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Why? Why would you help us? You don't even know who I am." Helen smiled sadly. "Because 40 years ago, I was you, sleeping in a car with a sick child, wondering whether tomorrow would be better or worse. Someone gave me a chance. Now I'm giving that chance to you. The next day, Eve began working. She cleaned, served customers, learned how to knead dough and bake bread. Maggie sat in the back room on the old sofa. Some days she was clear-headed and helped fold pastry boxes. Some days she screamed at the wall. Helen never complained. Not once. 3 months passed. Eve's life changed completely. She had steady income. Helen let them live in a small apartment above the bakery, asking no rent. For the first time in 2 years, Eve slept in a real bed, took hot showers, ate 3 meals a day. One afternoon, Helen caught Eve scribbling complex mathematical equations on pastry wrapping paper during her break. "Where did you learn this?" "Northwestern, before everything happened." Helen looked at Eve differently. "Then you're not just an ordinary waitress, are you?" Eve didn't answer. She only went back to work. 6 months with Helen were the happiest of Eve's adult life. She should have known good things never lasted. 5:01 a.m. on a Tuesday. Eve woke like always, getting ready to help Helen knead dough for the first batch of bread. But the lights in the shop weren't on. Helen always turned them on at 4:30. Always. Eve pushed open the back door. It was wide open. Her heart clenched. Helen lay on the cold kitchen floor. one hand still gripping a sack of flour that had spilled around her like white snow. Her eyes were closed. Her face looked strangely peaceful. "Helen." Eve ran to her, dropped to her knees, shook her gently. No response. She touched Helen's hand. Ice cold. The body was already stiff. Eve called 911 with trembling hands, but she already knew. Heart attack. Helen had died while preparing to open the bakery she'd loved for 40 years. Alone in the kitchen at 4:30 a.m. Helen had no family, no husband, no children, no one at all. The bakery was sold to pay debts and funeral costs. The new owner was a heavy-set man with calculating eyes who came on the third day and said, "I don't need freeloaders. Get out before the weekend." Within 1 week, Eve lost everything. The job, the apartment, the only person in the world who had cared. Helen's funeral took place on a rainy day. Eve was the only one who came besides the attorney handling the will. She stood by the simple coffin, rain soaking through her clothes, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for giving me 6 months to be human again. I'm sorry I couldn't save you the way you saved me." That afternoon, Eve led her mother back to the Honda Civic. It was still parked in its old spot in the alley, as if it had been waiting for them to come home. 2 months after Helen's death, Eve found a new job. She became a server at the Iron Horse Roadhouse, a biker bar on the south side of Chicago. The first time she stepped inside, Eve felt like she'd entered another world. The place was dark, lit by neon beer signs and dim overhead lights. The smell of motor oil, leather, and whiskey hung thick in the air. Chrome motorcycles lined up outside like soldiers. Men in leather vests covered with patches lounged at tables, tattoos covering their arms. Women in tight jeans and tank tops laughed loudly, their voices cutting through the rumble of classic rock from the jukebox. Eve wore a black uniform and moved among people who probably made in a single night more than she did in a month. She didn't know who owned this place. She didn't know what deals happened in the back rooms. She only knew the pay was decent and the tips were generous. For her, that was enough. Eve worked the night shift, 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., so she could care for her mother during the day. Maggie stayed at a shelter every night. Eve hated leaving her there, hated the damp smell, hated the rows of cots pressed close together, hated how people looked at her mother like she was a burden. But she didn't have another choice. At the bar, Eve kept her distance from everyone. No small talk, no friendships. She'd learned that lesson already. Every time she let someone close, they left. One night, the atmosphere in the bar suddenly changed. The other servers began whispering, straightening their uniforms, standing taller. "Reaper's coming tonight. Everyone brace yourselves." Eve turned to a coworker. "Who's Reaper?" The girl stared at Eve like she'd just asked if the earth was round. "The president of the Iron Disciples MC, owner of this bar, owner of everything for 10 blocks. Don't look him in the eyes. Don't speak unless spoken to. Best thing is don't exist." Eve didn't really understand, but she nodded. She had enough trouble in her life already. Late that night, while clearing a table near the pool room, Eve accidentally overheard a conversation drifting from the room behind the bar. A man's voice, low and hard. "Scorpions are making a move on the east side, testing our territory." Then another voice answered, so cold it raised goosebumps on Eve's arms. "Let them test. When the time comes, I'll finish them." Eve shivered. She hurried away, heart pounding. She realized she was working somewhere far more dangerous than she'd imagined. But there was one thing she didn't know. At 11 p.m., Eve passed a shadowed corner behind the bar and saw something unusual. A girl sat alone, head bowed over a table, books and papers spread around her, her shoulders shaking. She was crying. Eve hesitated. This wasn't her business. But then she remembered herself at 15, crying alone after her father left. She walked over. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl looked up, face blotched red, eyes swollen from tears. "Do I look okay?" Her voice was both angry and desperate. Eve looked at the table. A math test lay in the middle of the scattered books. A bright red F stamped across it. "I'm stupid," the girl said, voice catching. "Everyone knows it. The teachers, the other kids, my father." Eve stayed quiet for a moment. Then she asked gently, "Can I look at your test?" The girl looked surprised, then shoved the paper over. Maybe she thought Eve would laugh too, like everyone else. Eve scanned the test for 30 seconds. She saw the problem immediately. "You're not stupid," she said. "You're just doing it the wrong way. Let me show you." Eve took a pen and rewrote the problem differently. She explained each step, simple and clear, without complicated terms. The girl stared at the paper, and little by little, her eyes began to brighten. "Wait, that's all it is? That's all it is?" Eve nodded. "Math isn't hard. It's just that sometimes it's taught the wrong way." The girl looked at Eve like she was a miracle. "Who are you?" "Just a server." The girl was silent for a moment, then suddenly blurted out, "Can you teach me? Not here. Somewhere private. My father can't know." Eve shook her head. "I'm just a server. I'm not a tutor." "Please," the girl begged. "I'll pay whatever it costs." Eve looked into the girl's desperate eyes. They were the same eyes Eve had seen in the mirror 12 years earlier. A lonely child who felt she wasn't enough, aching for someone to believe in her. "Keep your money," Eve said. "I'll help you, but this stays between the two of us." The girl's face lit up. "I'm Chloe Thornton." Eve didn't know that 10 minutes of conversation in the dark corner of a biker bar would change her life forever. She'd just agreed to secretly tutor the daughter of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Harold Washington Library. 4 p.m. on a Thursday, a quiet corner on the 4th floor. This became their secret place. 3 times a week after Chloe's school day, and before Eve's shift at the Iron Horse, they met here. Chloe lied to her bodyguards, telling them she was in a study group. Eve stole 2 precious hours before she had to go to work. No one knew. No one was allowed to know. The first week was the hardest. Chloe had lost faith in herself long ago. She believed she was stupid, that math wasn't meant for her. Eve had to break that wall before she could teach anything. She didn't just teach formulas. She taught Chloe how to see problems differently. She taught her that being wrong didn't mean failure. It meant a chance to understand more clearly. She taught her that being smart wasn't knowing everything. It was not quitting when you didn't understand. In the first 2 weeks, Chloe went from an F to a D. In weeks 3 and 4, from a D to a C. By the second month, the girl had reached a B. With every small step forward, Eve celebrated as if it were a great victory. Because for a child who'd once believed she was worthless, every step forward was a miracle. One afternoon, in the middle of a lesson, Chloe suddenly asked, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know who my father is." Eve paused and looked out the library window. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing at all. I'm just passing it on." "Who was it?" Eve was silent for a long time. Helen's image rose in her mind. The small kitchen at 5 a.m., the smell of freshly baked bread, the gentle smile. Chloe didn't ask again. Maybe she could hear the pain in Eve's voice. Instead, she began to talk about her own family. "My mother died giving birth to me," Chloe said, her voice growing smaller. "I've always felt like it was my fault, like I took her life so I could exist." Eve took the girl's hand and listened in silence. "My father loves me, I know that, but he doesn't know how to show it. He only knows how to give money, buy expensive things, hire security. He thinks money can fix everything. But I don't need money. I just want him to be proud of me, just once." Eve understood that feeling more than anyone. Meanwhile, Eve's life kept moving. Every morning, she picked Maggie up from the shelter. Every night, she brought her mother back before going to work. There were good days when Maggie recognized her, even smiled. There were bad days when she looked at Eve like a stranger, screaming that she wanted to go home, even though she didn't know where home was. Eve used her tips to buy medication for her mother. Not enough money for the good kind, only the cheap, generic kind. But something was better than nothing. Then, that day arrived. Chloe ran into the library, glowing, a sheet of paper in her hand. She threw her arms around Eve and sobbed. "I got an A, my first A in my whole life." Eve held her and her own tears spilled over. She cried from pride. She cried because she remembered herself once, the top student with a future bright as a promise. She cried for the education dream she'd been forced to give up. "I knew you could do it," Eve whispered. "I always knew." But they didn't know that Chloe's success had created consequences. The teacher called Jake Reaper Thornton, praising his daughter's remarkable leap forward. Reaper was surprised. He studied Chloe over dinner that night. "How did you improve so fast?" Chloe tried to keep her face calm. "I just studied harder." Reaper didn't believe it. From an F to an A in 2 months. No one did that alone. He called his second-in-command into his office that very night. "Chains, find out what my daughter does after school. Every detail. Don't miss anything." Under the flickering fluorescent lights of a public library, 2 girls from 2 different worlds found what they needed. Chloe found a teacher. Eve found a purpose. But someone was watching, and their secret was about to be exposed. Tuesday, 5 p.m., Harold Washington Library, 4th floor. Their familiar corner. Eve and Chloe were studying like always. Chloe was laughing, talking about her strict literature teacher. Eve was explaining a geometry problem. Everything was normal. Until Chloe suddenly froze. Her smile vanished. Her face went pale as if she'd just seen a ghost. Eve turned around. Jake Reaper Thornton stood in the doorway. He was 41 years old, 6'3", built like someone who'd spent his life fighting. His leather vest was covered in patches, Iron Disciples MC across the back, President Rocker on the front, various pins marking years of membership. His arms were covered in tattoos, eagles and skulls and flames. His dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. His gray eyes, cold as a Chicago winter, swept the room and stopped on their table. Behind him were Chains, his second-in-command, and 2 massive club enforcers. Their faces were expressionless as stone. The library felt like the air had been sucked out. People nearby began to leave. No one dared stay close to these men. Jake Reaper Thornton wasn't the kind of man who smiled. At 41, he'd buried a wife, built an empire, and learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The line of his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His presence alone made people step aside without being told. But when he took in the scene in front of him, his daughter laughing, her head bent over a math book, sitting across from a woman in worn clothes with tired eyes, something in him shifted. Only for an instant. Then it disappeared. "Dad." Chloe sprang to her feet, her voice trembling. "I can explain." Reaper lifted a hand. Chloe went silent immediately. He walked forward, each step echoing through the quiet. His motorcycle boots heavy on the library floor. Eve stood up. She didn't lower her head. She didn't step back. She'd lived through too many terrible things to be afraid of anything anymore. "Who are you?" Reaper asked, his voice low and hard. "Evelyn Carter. I work at your bar, and I've been tutoring your daughter." "You've been meeting my daughter in secret for 2 months." "Yes." Reaper stared at her. Those gray eyes didn't blink. "Give me one reason not to make you disappear." Eve didn't flinch. "I don't have one. Do whatever you want." Silence stretched out, tense enough to cut. Then Reaper signaled to the enforcers. "Take her." Eve's heart tightened. She thought she was going to die. But she didn't run. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She'd already lost too much. If she lost her life today, at least she'd leave with her back straight. "Dad, no!" Chloe screamed, lunging to stand in front of Eve. "You can't do this. She only helped me. She's the only person who believed I wasn't stupid. Please, Dad." Reaper looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Eve. This girl wasn't shaking. She wasn't pleading. She stood tall in front of him as if he were just an ordinary man, not someone who could end her life with a single nod. He'd never met anyone like that. "Bring her to my bike," Reaper said. "We need to talk." What happened next would change everything. Eve was taken outside to where Reaper's Harley-Davidson sat gleaming under the afternoon sun. Custom paint job, chrome everywhere, worth more than Eve had earned in her entire life. Chains brought out a second bike, and Reaper gestured to it. "Get on. We're going for a ride." Eve had never been on a motorcycle in her life, but she climbed on behind Reaper without hesitation. Chloe was kept behind, her worried face watching them leave. They rode through Chicago. The engine roared beneath them. Wind whipped Eve's hair. For a moment, she forgot she might be riding to her own execution. For a moment, she just felt the power and freedom of the road. They stopped at Lincoln Park, near the lake. Reaper got off his bike and walked to a bench overlooking the water. Eve followed. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Reaper said, "My people tell me you're homeless, sleeping in a car with a mother who's mentally ill, dropped out of Northwestern halfway through. You have nothing." "You did your homework," Eve said calmly. "I always do. Now tell me, why are you helping my daughter? What do you want?" "I don't want anything. She needed help. I helped, that's all." Reaper stared at her. "Nobody does anything without wanting something back." Eve met his eyes directly. "You're right. I want to see her succeed. I want to prove that one person can make a difference, and I want to feel useful once in this miserable life. There. Are you satisfied?" Reaper fell silent. In his mind, thoughts churned. This girl wasn't like anyone he'd met in the MC world. Not afraid, not flattering, not hungry for money. She could die right now and still wouldn't lower herself. "My daughter went from an F to an A in 2 months," he said slowly. "The teacher thinks it's a miracle." "It isn't a miracle," Eve said. "She's smart. She just needed someone to teach her the right way." Reaper turned to look at the lake. Boats moved slowly across the water. "It isn't a miracle," he repeated, softer. Then, without warning, he said something Eve didn't expect. "She hasn't smiled like that since her mother died." Eve went quiet. She didn't know what to say. 15 years, Reaper continued, still looking at the water. 15 years I gave her everything money can buy. The best schools, the best clothes, security 24/7. And you, a stranger with nothing at all, gave her something I couldn't." He turned back to Eve. His gray eyes were still cold, but something else was there now. Not a threat anymore. Something Eve couldn't read. Anger, curiosity, or something else entirely. "Don't go anywhere," he said. "We're not finished talking." Still by the lake, Reaper made a phone call to Chains. When he turned back to Eve, his gray eyes weighed her as if measuring every detail. "Your mother. What's wrong with her?" Eve stayed guarded. "Why do you care?" "Answer the question." "Schizophrenia?" Eve said after a moment. "It started after my father left 12 years ago." "And you've taken care of her alone ever since?" "Since I was 15. Yes." Silence stretched between them. Reaper didn't speak. He only looked at Eve, his face unreadable. The most dangerous man on Chicago's South Side, studying a homeless waitress like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I have a proposition," Reaper said abruptly. "I'm listening." "You'll tutor Chloe officially. You'll be paid generously. You'll move into the guest house on my property, so you'll be available whenever she needs you." Eve blinked. She thought she'd misheard. "What?" "You heard me." Eve stared at him, searching for any sign of a joke or trap, but Reaper's face was completely serious. "And my mother?" Eve asked. "What about her? I'm not going anywhere without her." "If you want me, you take her too. No negotiation." The silence turned sharp. Eve held her breath. She knew she was gambling. A man like Reaper wasn't used to conditions. He could get angry. He could pull the offer back. He could do something worse. "If that's a problem, then thank you for the offer. But no." "She comes too," Reaper cut in. Eve went still. "Just like that?" "I don't do anything halfway, Miss Carter," Reaper said, his voice still even. But there was something different in it. "Your mother will receive full medical care. The best psychiatrists in Chicago. Comprehensive treatment. It won't cost you a cent." Eve couldn't breathe. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing all of this?" Reaper was quiet for a long time. He looked out at the lake, sunlight glinting off the water in sharp flashes. "My wife died giving birth to Chloe," he said, his voice sinking lower. "I blamed myself for years. I buried myself in the club, in building the territory, in becoming untouchable, and somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be a father." Eve listened, not daring to interrupt. "My daughter is drowning right in front of me, and I didn't see it," Reaper went on. "You did. A stranger with nothing saw what I, with all my power and money, couldn't see." He turned back to Eve. His gray eyes were still cold, but something else lived there now. An admission. Maybe respect. "So yes, I'll help your mother. Not because I'm generous, because I owe you. And I always pay my debts." Eve looked back at the city skyline. She thought about the Honda Civic with the broken air conditioner waiting in a dark alley. Thought about the damp-smelling shelter where Maggie was sitting alone. Thought about nights of winter cold that left her trembling. Thought about Helen, the woman who had given her a chance when no one else would. "Helen," Eve whispered to herself. "Maybe this is my second chance." "All right," Eve said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Deal." "Deal," Reaper replied. He held out his hand. Eve stared at it for a second, then took it. When their hands touched, Eve realized something. His hand was warm. Not cold like the exterior. Not cold like those gray eyes. Reaper seemed to notice something too. His gaze flickered, only for an instant. Then he pulled his hand back quickly and turned to his motorcycle. "Chains," he called into his phone. "Take Miss Carter back to get her things. Tomorrow morning pick her up and her mother. Bring them to the compound." That night, Eve sat in the broken car for the last time. Maggie was asleep beside her, breathing evenly. Eve looked up at the night sky through the cracked windshield. Tomorrow everything would change. She didn't know whether she was stepping into salvation or a trap. She didn't know what that man truly wanted. She didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in years, she had something she'd thought she'd forgotten long ago. A reason to hope. The custom van came to a stop in front of the gates of the Iron Disciples compound. Eve guided her mother out, then stood frozen as she took in what lay before her. No, calling it a house wasn't right. It was a fortress. The compound covered 3 acres on the far south side. 10-foot walls topped with security cameras surrounded the property. The main clubhouse was a massive 2-story structure, half warehouse, half mansion. Chrome motorcycles lined up in perfect rows in the parking area. A garage big enough to hold 30 bikes sat to the left. To the right was a smaller building, the guest house where Eve and Maggie would live. The gate was wrought iron, custom made, the Iron Disciples skull logo worked into the metal. "Look, Evie, the ocean. We're at the beach." Maggie suddenly cried out, eyes bright. She pointed at the fountain in the courtyard, face glowing like a child's. Eve smiled sadly. "That's right, Mama. We're at the beach. Sonar." Maggie ran to the fountain, cupped her hands to catch the water, laughed. She spun in circles, letting the spray splash her face, happy as if this were the most beautiful place on earth. "Eve!" a voice called from the clubhouse door. Chloe ran out, hair flying, face radiant. She threw her arms around Eve, not caring that club members were watching. "You really came. You're really staying. I thought my dad would throw you out. I thought I'd never see you again." Eve patted her back gently. "I'm not that easy to get rid of." Chloe smiled, tears shining at the corners of her eyes. Behind them, a middle-aged woman stepped out. Club matriarch, wife of one of the original members. Her name was Patricia. She wore tight jeans and a leather vest, hair teased high, arms covered in faded tattoos. She looked Eve up and down. Worn clothes, shoes rubbed down at the heels, tangled hair. Then she looked at Maggie dancing around the fountain. Contempt was plain in Patricia's eyes. Even though she didn't say a word, Eve noticed that look. She was used to it, used to being judged, used to being looked down on, used to being seen as trash. She didn't care. She didn't have the strength to care anymore. "Patricia." Reaper's voice came from the doorway. He stepped out, leather vest over a black t-shirt, boots heavy on the concrete. His gray eyes swept over the scene. "Yes, Prez?" "This is Evelyn Carter. She and her mother will be staying in the guest house. You will treat them with the respect you give my daughter. Is that clear?" Patricia swallowed. "Yes, Prez." Reaper looked straight into her eyes, his voice dropping, sharper. "I asked if that was clear." "Perfectly clear, Mr. Thornton." Reaper nodded, then turned to Eve. "Chains will take you to the guest house. If you need anything, say so." Then he turned and walked back inside without another word. The guest house sat at the edge of the compound, separated from the main clubhouse by several dozen meters. When Eve opened the door and stepped inside, she had to swallow a gasp. 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a small kitchen with everything it needed. All of it clean, bright, warm. Bigger than anywhere she'd ever lived in her life. A real bed with soft blankets, heat that worked, hot water running from the tap. Eve helped her mother onto the sofa. Maggie fell asleep immediately, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a long time. Maybe for the first time in years she felt safe. Eve stood in the middle of the room and looked around. Then she began to cry. For the first time in months, the tears came hard and fast beyond her control. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying because she didn't know what to call it. Relief, gratitude, fear, all of it at once. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, God, please let this be real." A soft knock came at the door. "Eve, are you okay?" Chloe's worried voice floated in from outside. Eve wiped her face quickly, drew a deep breath, and opened the door. "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm just adjusting." Chloe looked at Eve's reddened eyes, but didn't mention the tears. She only took Eve's hand and squeezed it gently. "I know this is a lot, but you're safe now. I promise." Eve looked at the 15-year-old girl comforting her, and without meaning to, she smiled. "When did you grow up so fast?" "Because I have a good teacher," Chloe said with a grin, then hugged Eve again before running back to the main clubhouse. That night, Eve lay on a real bed for the first time in months. Not hungry, not cold, not afraid of being woken by strangers or police. She should have felt safe. But lying in the dark, staring up at the ceiling of a room that wasn't hers, she couldn't shake one thought. What does he really want from me? The truth was coming, and it would be more devastating than anything she could imagine. 1 month passed. Eve slowly grew used to her new life. A life she'd never dared to dream of. Every morning at 8 a.m., a nurse came to check on Maggie and make sure she took her medication on time. From 10 a.m. until noon, Eve tutored Chloe in the private study inside the clubhouse. In the afternoon, she had time for herself, reading in the clubhouse library or walking through the compound grounds. In the evening, she ate dinner with Chloe and Reaper. He was often absent because of club business, but on the nights he was there, the atmosphere turned strange. Tense, as if something invisible were stretched tight between them. Reaper began to appear more often during the lessons. He sat in the corner of the room, silently watching Eve teach his daughter. At first, Eve felt observed, but not in a threatening way, more as if he was trying to understand something. Sometimes he asked questions. "Why do you explain it that way?" Eve answered. "Because she's a visual learner. She needs to see the pattern, not just hear the formula." Reaper would nod and store it away. No further comment. But Eve noticed afterward, when he spoke to Chloe, he began explaining things with more concrete examples. He was learning how to be a father from her. Small moments began to add up. One morning in the library, Eve and Reaper reached for the same book on a high shelf. Their hands brushed. They both pulled back at once, as if they'd touched fire. At one dinner, Eve looked up and caught Reaper watching her. His gaze had softened. Not as cold as the first day anymore. Something else lived there. He turned away quickly and went back to eating as if nothing had happened. Once, Maggie suddenly became agitated, running through the compound yard, shouting about things that weren't there. Eve ran after her, trying to calm her down, and Reaper was the first person to appear at Eve's side. He didn't say anything. He simply helped Eve guide Maggie back to the guest house. His face showed no irritation, no disgust, only understanding. Then that night came. 2 a.m. Eve couldn't sleep. She tossed on the bed, thoughts turning too loud, and finally decided to go out and walk in the compound yard. The night air was cool. Moonlight flooded the grounds. And she saw him. Reaper sat alone on a stone bench beside the fountain, a bottle of whiskey set next to him, his eyes fixed on nothing. He looked strangely lonely. The most powerful man on Chicago's South Side, sitting here alone at 2 a.m., drinking and staring into the void. Eve meant to turn back. She didn't want to intrude. But Reaper spoke. "Can't sleep either?" Eve stopped. Then she walked over and sat down on the bench, keeping a safe distance from him. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, only the sound of water from the fountain and the rustle of wind in the trees. "My wife loved this place," Reaper said suddenly, his voice low and far away. "She used to sit here every night before bed. She said the stars in Chicago weren't as bright as back home in Montana, but they were still beautiful." Eve listened in silence. "You must miss her." Reaper took a swallow of whiskey. "Every day. It's been 15 years, and it still feels like yesterday." He paused and looked up at the sky filled with stars. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "Chloe is exactly like her. The same eyes, the same smile, and every time I look at my daughter, I see the woman I lost." Eve understood then. Now she understood why he always kept his distance from Chloe. The pain was too much. Every glance at his daughter reminded him of what he'd lost. The silence stretched. Reaper didn't deny it. "Maybe," he whispered. Eve stared out into the distance. "My father left when I was 15, she said, her voice calm, as if she were telling someone else's story. "No warning, no explanation. He only left a note that said, 'I can't do this anymore.'" Reaper turned to look at her. "And your mother?" "She was never the same again. Something broke inside her. The doctors called it schizophrenia. I call it a shattered heart that forgot how to heal." "You were just a child. You shouldn't have had to carry that alone." Eve smiled sadly. "Life doesn't care about should or shouldn't. It just happens." They sat in silence for a few minutes. No one spoke, just two people under the stars, sharing the loneliness they'd carried for so many years. "Thank you," Reaper said suddenly. Eve turned toward him. "For what?" "For not telling me it wasn't my fault. Everyone else says that, but it doesn't help." Eve looked at him. For the first time, she met those gray eyes without fear. "Because it was your fault. And it wasn't. Both things can be true at the same time." Reaper looked at her, and Eve saw something else in his eyes. Not the familiar coldness, not the calculating gaze of a club president, but vulnerability. For the first time, he let her see the real person inside. That night, something shifted between them. They were no longer just an employer and a hired hand, no longer strangers forced into the same circumstance. They were two broken people who had finally found someone who understood. And that was more dangerous than anything either of them could recognize. But there was one thing neither of them knew. The father who'd abandoned Eve 12 years ago had just made contact with the club's most dangerous enemy, and the betrayal he was about to commit would nearly destroy everything Eve had fought to protect. 3 weeks after that conversation by the fountain, Reaper brought Maggie to see Dr. Nathan Cole, the leading psychiatrist in Chicago. Lakeside Psychiatric Hospital was unlike anywhere Eve had ever taken her mother. There were no dark, mildew-reeking hallways, no screams echoing from patient rooms, no indifferent looks from staff who'd grown too used to suffering. Instead, the rooms were bright. Sunlight poured through large windows, clean, quiet. The staff smiled and spoke patients' names with respect. Dr. Cole was a middle-aged man with warm eyes and a patient voice. He didn't treat Maggie like a crazy patient. He treated her like a human being who needed healing. In the first week, the second week, Maggie was put on new medication. Her body responded well. The delusions began to fade. She no longer screamed at walls or talked to people who didn't exist. By the third week, Maggie began to have longer stretches of clarity. She knew where she was. She asked about Eve. She even remembered the doctor's name. Eve began to hope. For the first time in 12 years, she dared to think that maybe her mother would come back. Then the 20th day arrived. Dr. Cole called Eve into his office. His expression was grave. Eve's heart clenched the moment she saw that look. "Miss Carter, I need to be honest with you," Dr. Cole said, his voice gentle but heavy with what he couldn't hide. "Your mother's condition is very severe. Many years without proper treatment have caused significant damage." Eve swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means a full recovery is unlikely. She may never return to who she was before." Eve didn't say anything. She stood up and walked out of the office. Her feet carried her to the restroom. She locked the door, and she cried. Silently, desperately. She leaned her back against the cold wall, both hands clamped over her mouth so no one would hear the sobs. 12 years. 12 years of fighting. 12 years of sacrificing everything. And now the doctor was telling her her mother would never come back. Was all of it meaningless? When Eve stepped out, eyes red and swollen, she saw Reaper standing in the hallway. He didn't say anything about her puffy eyes. He only said quietly, "I heard. I'm sorry." Eve didn't answer. She just stood there, exhausted, hollow, empty. "Don't give up," Reaper said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "Go see her." Eve looked at him. She didn't understand why he was here, why he cared. But she nodded and walked toward Maggie's room. Her mother was sitting on the bed, staring out the window, silent. Afternoon sunlight fell over her gray hair, forming a faint halo. Eve sat down beside the bed and took her mother's hand. That hand was thin and wrinkled but still warm. "Mama, it's me. Evie." Maggie didn't react. She kept looking out the window as if Eve didn't exist. Eve felt her heart break one more time. Maybe the doctor was right. Maybe her mother would never come back. She started to stand, ready to accept what couldn't be changed. Then Maggie squeezed her hand. Eve froze. Maggie turned to look at her, and her eyes were clear, bright, present, for the first time in years. "Sweetheart," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you? Is it my Evie?" Eve collapsed. She sobbed and clung to her mother as if letting go would make her disappear. All the years of holding it in burst out at once. "Yes, Mama, it's me! I'm here! I'm here!" Maggie lifted a hand and stroked her daughter's hair, her eyes full of tears. "You're so beautiful. You look so tired. Are you eating enough?" Eve cried and laughed at the same time. "Yes, Mama, I'm eating enough now." Outside the hospital room window, Reaper stood in silence, watching. He saw Eve, the strong woman who had never cried in front of him, falling apart in her mother's arms. He saw Maggie, the sick woman the world had abandoned, stroking her daughter's hair as if she were still the child she'd once been. A strange feeling rose in his chest, something warm, something he didn't know how to name. Chains stepped up beside him. "Prez, is everything all right?" Reaper didn't look away, his eyes still fixed on the scene inside the room. "Everything's all right. More than all right." Later, Dr. Cole told Eve that moments like this were very rare, windows of clarity that arrived without warning. He couldn't promise they would last. But right now, in this precious moment, Maggie had returned. And Eve held on to it as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. Because it was. What Eve didn't know was that outside the hospital, in a parking lot 3 blocks away, a man sat in a car watching the building through binoculars. Richard Hayes, Eve's father, the man who'd abandoned her 12 years ago. And he was making a phone call. "Yeah, I confirmed it. She's here every Tuesday and Thursday, same time. The mother's alone in room 314 for about an hour while the daughter meets with staff." A voice crackled through the phone. "Good work, Hayes. The Scorpions MC will make this worth your while. Stay close. When we move, we'll move fast." Richard Hayes hung up the phone and stared at the hospital building. For just a moment, his face showed something that might have been regret. Then it hardened again. He needed the money. That was all that mattered. The truth they buried for 12 years. 2 weeks after Maggie's miracle, life in the compound became strangely normal. Normal in a way Eve had never known. Her mother still had good days and bad days, but the good days came more often. Chloe grew more confident, more radiant. And Reaper, the cold man all of Chicago feared, began coming home earlier to eat dinner with his family. Then the good news arrived. Final exams ended. Chloe earned an A in every subject, for the first time in her life. Street Catherine Academy called with praise. Chloe had made astonishing progress and had the potential to become the top student in her class. Reaper decided to host a small dinner to celebrate. Only 4 people: him, Chloe, Eve, and Maggie. That day was a good day for Eve's mother. She was clear, recognized everyone, even dressed nicely on her own to come to dinner. They sat around the long table in the clubhouse dining room, but there was none of the distant formality of club meetings. They sat close, like a real family. Midway through the meal, Chloe stood up, a glass of orange juice in her hand, her expression solemn. "I want to thank someone," she said, looking at Eve. "Eve, you didn't have to help me. You had every reason to focus on yourself and your mother, but you chose to spend your time teaching a spoiled rich kid who couldn't add fractions." Eve smiled. "You're not spoiled, and you've always known how to add fractions. You just thought you didn't." Chloe laughed, her eyes shining. "What I mean is, you're the big sister I've always wished for, and I hope you know that." Eve felt her throat tighten. She was about to say something when Maggie spoke up unexpectedly. "My Evie is very good at teaching," she said, her voice clear and present. "She used to teach me how to remember things. 'Repeat it 3 times, Mama,' she always said. 'Repeat it 3 times.'" Eve turned to her mother, so shocked she could barely breathe. "You remember that?" 12 years, back when Eve had been a first-year college student, teaching her mother how to remember to take her medicine. And her mother remembered. Reaper looked at Eve across the table. A rare warmth flickered in his gray eyes. He raised his whiskey glass. "To family, however we find it." Their eyes met and held. 1 second. 2 seconds. Too long to be accidental. Eve was the first to look away, her heart beating wild. After dinner, Chloe led Maggie upstairs to the guest house. The girl had grown used to caring for her, treating it as if she were taking care of her own grandmother. Eve stayed behind to clean up, even though it wasn't necessary. Old habits were hard to break. She'd been a server, had lived by clearing other people's tables. She didn't know how to sit still and let someone else serve her. "You don't need to do that," Reaper's voice came from behind her. "We have people for that." Eve didn't turn around. "I like feeling useful." Reaper walked into the kitchen and came close to get a glass of water. The distance between them was close. Too close. Eve could smell his cologne. Leather and motor oil and something else. Something that was just him. "Can I ask you something?" Reaper said. "Depends on the question." "Why do you always keep your guard up?" Eve stopped what she was doing and turned to him. "Because the last time I let it down, I got hurt." "Who hurt you?" "Everyone." Silence. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. The air grew thick. Eve could hear her own heartbeat. "I won't hurt you," Reaper said, his voice low and deep. "You don't know that." "No, I don't. But I want the chance to prove it." He lifted his hand and brushed Eve's face. His finger stopped on her cheek, warm and gentle. Eve forgot how to breathe. Her heart slammed as if it might break her ribs. They leaned toward each other. Gray eyes into brown, the space between them narrowed. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. A club member passed by. Reaper pulled his hand back as if burned. He walked out of the kitchen without a word. Eve stood alone, hands trembling, her heart still pounding wildly. That night, Eve lay in bed staring at the ceiling. "What are you doing, Eve?" she whispered to herself. "He's your employer. He's a club president. He's dangerous. He's the first person in years who has looked at you as if you weren't broken at all." She shook her head. "No, She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't. But even with her eyes closed, she could still feel his finger on her cheek. Warm. Gentle. As if she were something precious. At the same time, in his office, Reaper sat alone with a glass of whiskey. He stared into the liquid amber without drinking. Chains walked in. "Prez, we need to discuss the Scorpion situation. They've been—" "Not tonight," Reaper cut him off. Chains stopped. He looked at his boss and saw something different, something he'd never seen before. "Prez, is everything all right?" Reaper stared at the drink, his gaze far away. "I don't know." Two people lying to themselves with the same lie. This can't happen. But some feelings don't ask permission. They simply arrive. And neither of them knew that outside the compound walls, in a motel room 3 miles away, Richard Hayes was meeting with members of the Scorpion's MC, planning something that would shatter everything Eve had built. The betrayal was coming, and it would be worse than anything she could imagine. The next morning, Chains knocked on Reaper's office door with a grave expression. "Prez, we have a situation. There's a man at the gate. He claims he's Evelyn Carter's father." Reaper shot to his feet. "Her father? I thought he abandoned her 12 years ago." "He did. But he's back now. Says he's been looking for her everywhere. Heard she's living here." Reaper frowned. "How does he know she's here?" Chains looked at his boss. "That's exactly the question, isn't it, Prez?" Through the security cameras, Reaper watched the man standing outside the gate. Richard Hayes, 52 years old, salt and pepper hair, a weathered face marked by time and maybe by regret. His clothes were old but carefully arranged, as if he wanted to make a good impression. He stood there fidgeting, constantly glancing around, rubbing his hands together. When the gate guards asked his purpose, he broke down in tears. "I just want to see my daughter. Please, I'm her father. Foyt." In the study room, Eve was explaining a lesson to Chloe when Patricia knocked on the door. "Miss Carter, someone is here to see you." Eve looked up and saw something strange on the woman's face. She stood, moved to the window, looked outside, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. The man at the gate, that familiar posture, the way he lifted a hand to smooth his hair when he was nervous. 12 years had passed, but Eve recognized him instantly. "Eve." Chloe's worried voice came from behind her. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eve didn't turn around. Her voice was only a whisper. "I have." Reaper appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He looked at Eve, gray eyes searching. "The decision is yours. I can have him removed." Eve was silent for a long time. She stared out the window at the man who had abandoned her 12 years ago, standing there waiting. How many nights had she dreamed of this moment? How many times had she imagined what she would say if she ever saw him again? "No. Let him in. I need to face this." "Are you sure?" Eve turned to look at Reaper. "No, but I've been running for 12 years. It's time to stop." The clubhouse common room. Eve stood to one side, back straight, face blank. Richard sat across from her on a worn leather couch, more expensive than everything he'd ever owned in his life. Reaper stood in the corner, silently watching. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. "Evie, sweetheart, I'm sorry," Richard began, tears running down his wrinkled face. "I looked for you everywhere. I wanted to come back, but I didn't know how." "Stop," Eve cut him off, her voice flat as a frozen lake. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Eve asked. "Explain why you left a note and disappeared. Explain why you abandoned your wife when she needed you most. Explain why you left a 15-year-old girl to carry everything alone." Richard dropped his head. I was scared. I couldn't take it. Your mother was getting worse, and You were scared. Eve cut in, her voice starting to shake with anger. I was 15. I was terrified every day, but I didn't run. Richard looked up, his voice cracking. I made a mistake, Evie. I know that. But no matter what happens, I am still your father. You are a Hayes. I am not a Hayes. Eve spat the name back at him, her voice trembling with a decade of suppressed fury. The day you left us to rot, I threw that name in the trash along with every memory of you. I took my mother's maiden name, Carter, because she was the only parent who stayed to fight. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I don't owe a single syllable of my identity to a man named Richard Hayes. Evie, please, Richard pleaded. A father stays. A father fights. A father doesn't abandon his family just because things get hard. Eve surged forward, her eyes blazing. I want to make it up to you, Richard pleaded. I want to be in your life. Eve laughed, a bitter sound with no joy in it. Where were you when my mother screamed at the wall every night? Where were you when I had to drop out of school to pay for her medicine? Where were you when we slept in a car through 3 winters? Where were you? Richard went silent. No answer. No excuse could erase 12 years of absence. You don't get to come back when other people have done all the hard part, Eve said, her voice cold as ice. Get out. Evie, please. She told you to get out. Reaper stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. Richard looked up and for the first time realized who the man in the corner was. The patches on his vest, the skull logo, the word President. Fear flickered across his face. This isn't over, Richard said as the enforcers led him out. I'm still your father, whether you like it or not. The door shut. Eve sank into a chair, her hands trembling. All the strength she'd shown seemed to drain out at once. Chloe ran in and wrapped her arms around her. I'm sorry, Eve. Reaper stood still, not knowing what to say. He wasn't good at comforting, not good at showing emotion. But he was here, and that mattered more than any words. Eve looked up at him. Thank you for letting me handle it myself. Reaper nodded. Always. Outside the compound gates, Richard Hayes walked along the sidewalk, shoulders slumped, face hollow. What had he hoped for? That his daughter would forgive him? That everything would go back to how it was? A sleek black car pulled up beside him. The window slid down slowly. Mr. Hayes, a voice spoke from inside. I think we should talk. Richard looked into the car. 2 men with leather vests, Scorpion's MC patches on their backs. I hear you were rejected pretty brutally, the driver said, his voice coated in fake sympathy. Maybe we can help you get what you want. And you can help us with something we need. Richard hesitated for a second. Then he climbed into the car. The black vehicle rolled away slowly, carrying with it a darkness Eve didn't yet know was coming. Eve thought the worst was over. She thought she'd closed the door on the past. She was wrong. The biggest betrayal of her life was about to begin. That night, the biggest storm of the season slammed into Chicago. Rain poured in sheets. Wind howled against the windows. Thunder and lightning tore across the pitch-black sky. Eve lay on her bed, tossing, unable to sleep. In her head, Richard Hayes's words kept echoing. I'm still your father whether you want it or not. 12 years. 12 years he had vanished. And now he thought an apology could erase everything. At 2 a.m., Eve gave up on trying to sleep. She went down to the clubhouse common room, thinking there wouldn't be anyone there at this hour. She was wrong. Reaper was sitting on the couch alone in the darkness, staring through the window where rain was falling like a waterfall. He hadn't turned on any lights, only the occasional flash of lightning lit his face. Can't sleep either? Reaper asked, without turning around, as if he'd known she was there before she spoke. Too much in my head, Eve said. Want to talk? Eve hesitated for a second, then walked over and sat on the couch, keeping a safe distance from him. I can't stop thinking about what he said, she began, her voice tired. I'm still your father. As if DNA is all that matters. As if 12 years of absence can be erased by a single apology. Reaper looked at her. Blood doesn't make a family, actions do. Eve turned toward him. Do you feel that way about Chloe too? Reaper was silent for a long time. Lightning flared, throwing his face into stark light for a heartbeat. I wasn't a good father to her. Not really. I was a provider, a protector, but not what she needed. You're trying now, Eve said softly. That matters. Does it? Sometimes I feel like it's too late. It's never too late. Not if you truly want to change. Silence settled again. Only the storm's roar outside. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Reaper asked suddenly. Eve looked at him. Okay. When my wife died, I made myself a promise. I said I would never let anyone get that close again, because losing her, it almost destroyed me. That's why you push everyone away, Eve whispered. That's why I push everyone away, Reaper nodded. My daughter, my brothers, anyone who tries to get past the wall. Eve studied him. And yet you're sitting here talking to me at 2 a.m. Silence. Long. Tense. Yeah, Reaper finally said, his voice low and rough. I'm here. Eve drew a slow breath. Want to know a secret? I'm afraid. Every day in this compound. I'm afraid. Reaper turned to look at her. Afraid of what? Afraid all of this will end. Afraid I'll wake up one day and realize it was just a dream. Afraid someone will decide I'm not worth keeping. No one is sending you away, he said. You say that now. But what happens when I'm not useful anymore? When Chloe doesn't need a tutor, when... Stop. Reaper cut her off. He stood and moved closer to Eve. Her heart began to race. She stood too, not sure why. You think I'm keeping you here because you're useful? Isn't that why? At first maybe, but now... Now what? Reaper lifted his hand and gently tipped her chin up. His fingers were warm against her skin. His gray eyes held hers, and there was no coldness left in them at all. Only sincerity. And something else. Something dangerous. Now, I don't know who I'd be without you. He kissed her. Softly at first, as if he were afraid she might vanish. Then deeper when she didn't pull away. Eve kissed him back. Despite every reason screaming in her head that this was a mistake, that he was her employer, that he was a club president, that he was dangerous, that she was nobody. She didn't care. At least not right now. The storm raged outside. Thunder split the sky. But in this room, there were only two people. Two hearts beating in the same rhythm. When they finally pulled apart, Eve whispered, her breath still unsteady. This is a bad idea. I know. You're my employer. I know. You're a club president. I'm nobody. I have nothing to give you. Reaper looked at her, gray eyes serious and honest. You're the first person in 15 years who's made me feel something. That isn't nothing. That's everything. Eve didn't know what to say. She only stood there in his arms, listening to her own heartbeat, listening to the rain outside, listening to the distant thunder. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Outside, the storm still roared, but inside these walls, something else was happening. Two broken people finding shelter in each other. They both knew it couldn't last. The real world would catch up to them. His enemies, her past, 1,000 reasons why this was impossible. But for one night, they chose to forget them all. What they didn't know was that outside the compound, in that black car 3 miles away, Richard Hayes had just finished making a deal with the devil, and the consequences would shatter everything. 1 week after the kiss in the storm, everything seemed normal. Eve taught Chloe every day, ate dinner with the family every night, sometimes caught Reaper's gaze on her across the table. They didn't talk about that night. They didn't need to. Some things were bigger than words. That morning began like any other. Maggie went to therapy as usual, the nurse taking her to Lakeside Hospital at 8 a.m. Eve stayed home to teach Chloe literature. Reaper left early for a club run, promising he'd be back for lunch. Everything was peaceful. Peaceful enough that Eve should have been suspicious. At 11 a.m., Eve's phone vibrated, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something pushed her to pick up. "Miss Carter." A strange man's voice came through, low and cold. "We have your mother." Eve went rigid. The blood in her body seemed to stop. "What?" "If you want to see her alive again, tell your boyfriend to give us what we want. He has 24 hours. "Who are you? Where is my mother?" Eve shouted into the phone, her voice trembling. "Ask Reaper about the Scorpions MC and tell him this time it's personal." Click. Eve stood there with the phone still pressed to her ear. Her body turned to stone. Chloe looked up from her books. "Eve, what's wrong? You're white as a sheet." Eve didn't answer. She bolted from the room, looking for Reaper. He wasn't home yet. She called him, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "Reaper, someone took my mother. They said something about the Scorpions." Silence for a beat on the other end. Then Reaper's voice came, cold as ice. "Where are you?" "At the compound." "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming back, now." 15 minutes later, Reaper walked through the door with chains and 6 enforcers behind him. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't shouting. His face was cold, controlled, calculating. This was the Jake Reaper Thornton all of Chicago's South Side feared. "Tell me exactly what they said." Eve told him everything, word for word. Her hands shook uncontrollably. When she said the name Scorpions, Reaper's jaw locked. "Scorpions?" he snarled through clenched teeth. "Those bastards." "Who are they? What do they want?" "They're our rival club," Reaper said, his voice hard as steel. "They want our territory, our bar, our blood, and now they're using you to get to me." Chains stepped forward. "Prez, we traced the call, and we found something else. Richard Hayes has been in contact with Scorpions members all week." Eve felt as if a knife had gone straight into her chest. "What?" "He fed them information about Miss Carter's schedule, about Mrs. Margaret's appointments, about security gaps," Chains said evenly. "My own father sold me out," Eve whispered, her voice breaking apart. She sank into a chair. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, empty, as if someone had pulled her soul out of her body. Richard Hayes had abandoned her once. Now he'd betrayed her again, sold her mother to the enemy. For what? Money? Desperation? Or because he had never truly loved them at all? "Chains, mobilize everyone. I want the Scorpions' location within an hour," Reaper ordered, his voice without a tremor. "Prez, this could be a trap." "I don't care if it's a trap. Nobody touches what's mine." Eve looked up at him. "I want to come." "No, it's too dangerous." "That's my mother." Eve stood, looking straight into Reaper's eyes. "I'm going." Reaper looked back at her. He saw the determination in those brown eyes, the same steel he'd seen the first time he met her in the library. This girl didn't know what fear was. "Fine, but you stay in the van, no matter what happens." 1 hour later, the convoy of motorcycles and vans stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse on the far south side. The area was deserted, full of rusted shipping containers and wild weeds. Eve sat in the armored van, her heart beating like a war drum. Over the radio, she heard Reaper issuing orders, then footsteps, a door kicked in, gunfire, shouts, 10 minutes, 10 minutes that felt like 10 years. Eve sat there, fingernails digging into her palms, praying to anyone who might be listening. Please, please let my mother be safe. Then the radio crackled. Target secured. Mrs. Carter is safe. Eve didn't wait a second longer. She shoved open the van door and ran toward the warehouse. Reaper was stepping out, holding Maggie by the hand. She was tied up, clothes wrinkled, face streaked with tears and terror. But she was alive. Unhurt. "Mama!" Eve sobbed and threw her arms around her. "I'm here! I'm here now!" Maggie trembled in her daughter's arms. "The bad people, Evie. They kept asking about you. I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything." "I know, Mama," Eve cried, shaking. "You did so good. You did so good." The enforcers dragged someone else out of the warehouse. Richard Hayes. He looked pathetic, face swollen, clothes torn. Clearly the Scorpions had kept him to ensure his cooperation. When he saw Eve, he started crying. "Evie, I didn't know they'd hurt your mother. I just wanted money. I was desperate." Eve looked at him. The man who had given her life. The man who had abandoned her. The man who had sold her out. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel sadness, only emptiness, like she was looking at a stranger. Reaper stepped up beside Eve, his voice low. "What do you want me to do with him?" Eve stared at her father, the man who had abandoned her once and now betrayed her again. "Later," she said, her voice exhausted. "Right now, I just want to take my mother home." 3 days after the rescue, Maggie was stable. Luckily, she didn't remember much of what had happened. Her sick mind had protected her from the horrifying memory. She only knew she'd gone somewhere, met bad people, and then Evie came to bring her home. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes was being held in a room in the compound clubhouse, not a prison exactly, but not freedom either. Eve sat in the compound yard, staring into nothing. The fountain still murmured. The afternoon sun was still warm, but she couldn't feel any of it. Inside her head was a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions woven together. Chloe came and sat beside her, quiet for a moment before she spoke. "How do you feel?" Eve let out a breath. "I don't know. Angry, sad, relieved, all at the same time." Chloe studied her, eyes older than her years. "Do you hate him? Your dad?" Eve stayed silent for a long time. The afternoon sun touched her face, but it couldn't chase the darkness in her chest. "I should hate him. After everything he's done, I should hate him with my whole heart. But I'm tired of hating. I've carried this anger for 12 years. It's exhausting." Footsteps sounded across the grass. Reaper came up, his face blank, but his gray eyes watching Eve with a concern he didn't bother to hide anymore. "He wants to see you. You don't have to go. I can make him disappear, and you'll never have to think about him again." Eve looked up. "What would happen to him?" "He would never be found," Reaper said bluntly, without dressing it up. "That's my world, a place where people can vanish and no one asks questions." Eve looked at him. "Is that what you want me to choose?" "I want you to choose what gives you peace. Whatever it is, I'll support it." Eve stood and brushed grass from her skirt. "Take me to him." The holding room was clean but bare. Only a bed, a small table, and Richard Hayes curled in the corner. He looked ruined. 3 days without sleep, without food, terrified and waiting for his fate. When the door opened and Eve stepped in, Richard lunged forward and dropped to his knees at her feet. "Please, Eve, please forgive me. I'll do anything." Eve didn't speak. She only stood there, looking down at the man who had once been her father. The man she'd admired as a little girl. The man who had abandoned her. The man who had betrayed her. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Eve finally said, her voice strangely calm. Richard looked up, eyes raw with tears. "What?" "It's not that you left. It's not even that you sold us out to the scorpions." "Then what?" "It's that you never loved us enough to stay. Not when things got hard. Not when it truly mattered. You loved yourself more than you loved me or Mom." "That's not true," Richard sobbed. "Don't!" Eve cut him off, her voice sharp as ice. "Don't lie to me again." Silence. Richard wept at his daughter's feet like a child caught doing something wrong. "I'm not going to ask Reaper to kill you," Eve said, "and I'm not going to call the police." Richard lifted his head, not believing what he'd heard. You're letting me go?" "Yes, but not because you deserve it, because I deserve peace. Carrying this hatred is poison, and I don't want to drink it anymore." Eve turned to Reaper standing in the doorway. "Let him go. But if he comes near me or my mother again—" "He won't survive," Reaper said, his voice cold as ice. "Then we understand each other." The enforcers escorted Richard to the gate. Before he walked away, he looked back at Eve one last time, eyes full of tears and regret. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." Eve didn't answer. She turned and walked away without looking back. After Richard was gone, Reaper came to her side. "That was brave. I don't know if I could do that." Eve shook her head. "It wasn't brave. It was survival. If I keep hating him forever, he wins. He gets to live in my head without paying for it. I don't want to give him that power anymore." Reaper looked at her, gray eyes shimmering with something Eve couldn't read. "You're extraordinary, you know that?" "I'm just tired," Eve said. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, giving her something steady to hold on to. And Eve leaned into him, letting herself be weak for once in her life. That night, Eve slept more deeply than she had in years. No nightmares, no ghosts of the past. She had let go. 6 months passed. Life had changed completely in a way Eve had never dared to dream of. She was back in college, majoring in psychology at Northwestern, the place she'd been forced to leave 12 years earlier. Reaper had arranged everything, but Eve insisted she had to receive an official scholarship based on her own merit. And she did. Her grades were at the top of the class, as if the 12-year interruption had never happened. Chloe was preparing to graduate high school, ranked in the top 5 of her class at Street Catherine Academy. She'd applied to top universities and been accepted by many. From an F student no one believed in, Chloe had become the pride of the entire school. Maggie was more stable than ever. She still lived in the guest house with a nurse, painted every day, had more good days than bad now. She no longer screamed at walls or talked to people who weren't there. The new medication and proper care had brought a miracle Eve had once believed impossible. And Reaper. He had changed. He came home earlier, ate dinner with the family every day. He'd even learned how to smile. That rare smile on his cold face appeared more often now, especially when he looked at Eve or Chloe. He was still the president of the Iron Disciples MC, still the most feared man on Chicago's South Side. But inside this compound, he was only a man trying to be a better father and learning how to love again. One ordinary afternoon, Eve was reading in the clubhouse library when Reaper walked in. "Come with me." Eve looked up. "Where?" "Trust me." She looked at him and saw something mysterious glittering in those gray eyes. She set her book down and followed him. They rode through familiar Chicago streets on his motorcycle. Eve didn't ask anything else. She simply sat behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, watching the city through her helmet visor. When they stopped, she was surprised to recognize the place. Harold Washington Library. Why are we here? Reaper opened the door for her. This is where everything began, where you changed my daughter's life, and mine. They went inside, rode up to the 4th floor, walked to the quiet corner where Eve had once taught Chloe. Everything looked the same. Tall shelves, flickering fluorescent lights, the old wooden table. 10 months earlier, in this exact place, Eve had met a girl crying over an F in math, and Eve's life had turned in a completely different direction. Reaper turned to look at her. Then, suddenly, he dropped to one knee. "Reaper, what are you doing?" Eve's words caught when she saw him pull out a small box. "Evelyn Carter," Reaper began, his voice low and sincere. "10 months ago, I discovered a homeless server secretly tutoring my daughter in this library. I was angry. I wanted to make you disappear. But then I looked closer, and I saw someone who gave everything without asking for anything in return. Someone who carried the whole world on her shoulders and never complained. Someone who taught me that strength isn't power. It's getting back up every time life knocks you down. I'm not a good man. I've done things I can't take back. My hands aren't clean. My past isn't pretty. I have enemies who want to see me suffer. But you make me want to be better. You make me want to deserve you." He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring, not a huge diamond or glittering gemstone, just a silver band with a delicate design. "I didn't buy something expensive because I understand you. You don't want expensive. You want real, so here it is. Real. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life cherishing the woman who saw the man I could become." "Will you marry me?" Eve cried. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she was smiling too. She cried and laughed at the same time, as if she didn't know how else to react. "You're an idiot, proposing in a library where anyone can see." Reaper lifted an eyebrow, a flicker of worry crossing his face. "Is that a yes or—" "Yes," Eve cut in. 1,000 times yes. Reaper stood and pulled her into his arms, kissed her between the shelves and the dim lights. A few people nearby clapped. An elderly woman reading close by leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Young love, so beautiful." When they got home, Chloe was waiting at the door, her face bright with anticipation. "Well, how did it go?" Reaper looked at his daughter, the corner of his mouth curving into a rare smile. "She said yes." Chloe screamed and threw her arms around Eve. "I knew it! I knew it!" Maggie stepped out from the guest house. Today was a good day. She was clear, recognized everyone, even wearing the pretty dress Eve had bought for her. "What's all the noise?" Eve went to her mother and took her hand. "Mama, I'm getting married." Maggie looked at Reaper, then at Eve. Her eyes were clear and steady. "Is he a good man?" Eve smiled. "He's trying to become a good man, and that's enough." Maggie nodded, a gentle smile blooming on her lips. "Then I'm happy. My daughter deserves to be happy." That night, the 4 of them sat down to dinner together. Reaper, Eve, Chloe, and Maggie. They laughed, they talked. They were a family. Not by blood, by choice. And sometimes that kind of family is the strongest of all. The wedding day arrived. A small wedding in the compound yard. Not showy, not lavish, only the people closest to them. Chloe was the maid of honor, crying before the ceremony even began. Mascara smeared and she didn't care at all. Chains stood beside Reaper as best man. And for the first time in his life, that hard man truly smiled. Dr. Nathan Cole and Maggie's nurse were there too, along with a few new friends Eve had made at the university. There were no hundreds of guests, no press, no cameras, Only the people who truly mattered. The most special moment was when Maggie walked Eve down the aisle. Today was her best day. Completely lucid, completely present. As if the illness had retreated so she could witness the most important day of her daughter's life. "You look so beautiful, Evie," Maggie whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "Your father should have been here to see this." Eve squeezed her mother's hand. "I don't need him here, Mama. I have you. That's all I need." Maggie stopped, eyes reddening. I'm sorry for not being able to be with you through those years. My mind, it kept taking me far away." "Mama, stop." Eve turned to her, gentle but firm. "You were always there, even when you didn't know. You were the reason I kept fighting. I love you, my daughter." "I love you too, Mama." Reaper waited at the end of the aisle in a black suit. And for the first time in his life, he looked nervous. The man all of Chicago's South Side feared was trembling like a young man on his first date. When Eve reached him in a simple white dress, hair down, barely any makeup, he whispered, "You are breathtaking." Eve smiled. "You look pretty sharp when you clean up." They stood facing each other, hand in hand, and spoke their vows. "I, Jake Thornton, promise to protect you, not only from the outside world, but from myself. I promise to be better, to try harder, to never take you for granted. I promise to become the man you see when you look at me, even when I can't see myself that way. I, Evelyn Carter, promise to stand beside you through storms and through silence, through good days and days that feel unbearable. I promise to remind you who you are when you forget. I promise to be your home, the way you have become my home." I do. I do. The kiss. Small fireworks lifted into the afternoon sky. Chloe cried the loudest of everyone. Maggie clapped, beaming. "My daughter is married, my daughter is happy." At the celebration after the ceremony, Chloe stood to speak. "1 year ago I failed every class and believed I was stupid. Then a server in torn shoes taught me I was wrong. She didn't just teach me math. She taught me to believe in myself." The girl turned to Eve, tears streaming. "Eve, you're not just my tutor anymore. You are my sister." Then she looked at Reaper. "And Dad, thank you for finally letting someone in. Mom would be so proud." Reaper stood, and for the first time in front of everyone, he hugged his daughter. That night, after the guests had gone home, Eve stood alone on the balcony overlooking the compound, looking out at the Chicago sky. Reaper came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about how different my life is compared to 1 year ago. I used to sleep in a car, eat leftovers. Wonder if tomorrow was worth waking up for. And now I have a family, a home, a future. It doesn't feel real." "It is real," Reaper whispered against her ear. "It's your reality now, and I'll spend every day making sure you never have to doubt it." Eve lifted her eyes to the stars, the same stars she used to pray to through the cracked glass of a broken car long ago. "My name is Evelyn Carter Thornton," she whispered into the night. "Daughter of a woman the world called crazy, a college dropout, homeless, broken, but also a survivor, a fighter, a teacher, a wife." She closed her eyes and let the tears fall freely. "God, I used to beg you just to let me live through one more day. I didn't dare ask for more, but you gave me everything." A mother who remembers my name. A little sister who chose me. A man who saw me when no one else did. Thank you. I don't deserve it, but thank you. I will make every moment of this second chance count." And so the girl who once slept in a broken car under the bitter Chicago sky now stood beneath stars, surrounded by love. She had walked through fire. She had lost everything and rebuilt from ash. She had learned that family is not about blood, but about who stays when things get hard. Epilogue. So let me ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible? Like you were screaming for help and no one could hear you? Have you ever been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you most? Have you ever looked at someone's perfect life and wondered why you got the broken version? Evelyn Carter's story isn't a fairy tale. It's real, and real is always more powerful than fiction. Because somewhere right now, there's a girl sleeping in a car, a mother losing her mind, a child wondering if anyone will ever see them. And maybe you're that person. Maybe you've been that person. Maybe you know that person. This story isn't just about Evelyn. It's about every person society has written off as worthless, every person carrying burdens no one should have to carry alone, every person one kind gesture away from hope. Helen didn't have to give Evelyn a chance, but she did. And it changed everything. Reaper didn't have to help. But he did. And it changed everything. You don't have to be rich to change someone's life. You don't have to be powerful. You just have to see them. Really see them. Because the next time you walk past a homeless person on the street, remember Evelyn Carter. Northwestern scholarship student. Mathematical genius. The girl everyone ignored. The next time you judge someone for their struggles, remember Maggie Carter. Elementary school teacher. Loving mother. The woman whose mind broke because her heart did first. The next time you think one person can't make a difference, remember that every story in this video started with one person choosing kindness when cruelty was easier. Drop your story in the comments. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Has anyone ever given you a second chance that changed your life? Or have you been that person for someone else? Share this story. Not the sanitized version, the real version. The version that makes people uncomfortable. Because discomfort is where change begins. Because somewhere, a girl is sleeping in a car tonight, wondering if tomorrow is worth seeing. And maybe, just maybe, your share will reach the one person who can help her. Subscribe to channel. Because these stories matter. These people matter. You matter. And remember, no circumstance is permanent. No judgment is final. No person is worthless. Your past doesn't define you. Your struggle doesn't define you. The people who abandoned you don't define you. You define you. Stay just, stay loud, stay free.